February 2009. The night before the Grammys, the music world held its breath for Rihanna, the reigning queen of pop, her voice flooding radios, her image stamped on billboards from New York to Tokyo. She was 20 years old, invincible, a symbol of glamour and power. But before the spotlight could find her again, another story broke through, darker than any song she had ever sung. A photograph unintended, merciless spread like wildfire. Her face bruised, her eyes cast down. The world that once cheered now froze. Headlines screamed not of awards, but of violence. Rihanna, the girl who had risen from a small island to dominate global charts, had become the center of a tragedy no stage could contain. How could a love story so dazzling, a couple so adored, collapse into something so brutal? Why did no one see the signs? Or worse, why did no one intervene? What the camera showed was shocking enough. But the truth beneath was even heavier. A young woman shaped by childhood storms, repeating patterns she never asked for. To understand that night the scandal, the silence, the scars, we must step back. Back to Barbados. Back to the little girl who first learned that love can be both a lullaby and a warning. Robin Rihanna Fenty was born in 1988 on the island of Barbados, a paradise of turquoise seas and carnival rhythms. But for the little girl who would one day conquer the world, paradise was fractured. At home, the sound of waves often competed with the sound of arguments. Her father, battling addictions and temper, cast shadows over a childhood that should have been carefree. Her mother, trying to hold the family together, became both shield and witness. Rihanna grew up watching the fragile line between love and fear. She learned too early that affection could be withdrawn, that safety could vanish overnight. The little girl with bright eyes and braided hair carried inside her a quiet turbulence. She smiled at school, sang in the church choir, but when she closed her eyes, she was still that child listening for footsteps that might bring either comfort or chaos. At just 8 years old, she began suffering from crippling headaches. Doctors later linked them to the constant stress in her home. She retreated into music, humming melodies as if they could drown out the tension around her. Pop songs on the radio became her refuge, and the mirror became her stage. In that reflection, she imagined a world where applause might replace anger, where lights might finally chase away the dark. Friends would later recall her as different, both shy and fiery, soft and rebellious. Beneath her charm lay a determination carved from survival. She would not remain in the shadows that shaped her childhood. And yet, scars do not vanish, they transform. The longing for love, the craving for protection, these needs would follow her into adulthood, quietly guiding her choices. Rihanna's rise to fame would look like fate, but it was also escape. From the turbulence of her home, from the ghosts of fear, from the silence she no longer wanted to endure. What she could not know then was that the pattern she had lived as a child, the storm between affection and control, would return years later, this time beneath the blinding lights of fame. When Rihanna left Barbados at 16, she carried little more than a dream and a voice that could pierce through noise. The discovery by a visiting producer led her to New York, then to Jay-Z, and almost overnight, the shy island girl became a global sensation. Pon de Replay announced her arrival. Umbrella made her unstoppable. By her early 20s, Rihanna was no longer just a singer. She was a brand, a muse, a face the world could not turn away from. The transformation was dazzling. Covers of Vogue and Elle crowned her the new queen of style. Awards piled high, Grammys, Billboard trophies, platinum records. Each hit seemed like a bullet fired into the sky, louder than the last. Her Caribbean accent, her sharp fashion choices, her unshakable presence, everything about her screamed confidence. She was the girl who had survived storms and now ruled the airwaves with thunder. But behind the glamour, the cracks were already showing. Success meant endless tours, sleepless nights, and eyes that followed her everywhere. Privacy evaporated. Every dress she wore, every glance she exchanged became a headline. She was adored by millions, yet more isolated than ever. Fame had turned her into a mirror, reflecting desire, power, fantasy, but not always her true self. At just 20 years old, Rihanna stood at the pinnacle of an industry that demanded both perfection and vulnerability. The applause roared, but it could not soften the echo of her own loneliness. She longed for something simple: love without performance, intimacy without cameras. And then he appeared, Chris Brown. young, charismatic, equally adored. To the public, they were the golden couple, a fairy tale pairing of two rising stars. To Rihanna, he seemed like the answer to a question she had been asking since childhood. Could love finally feel safe? The world cheered their romance, blind to the storm gathering in silence. For behind the red carpets and the studio lights, love was already learning a darker rhythm, one that would soon shatter the illusion of invincibility she had built. At first, their story read like a pop anthem. Rihanna and Chris Brown, two prodigies of the same generation, two voices that defined a new era of R&B. Together, they looked untouchable, young, radiant, perfectly matched. They performed side by side, exchanged smiles on red carpets, whispered lyrics into each other's ears, as if the world itself were their stage. Fans called them the golden couple, the modern Bonnie and Clyde of music. But passion has a way of sharpening into something else. Behind the cameras, the sweetness curdled into tension. Friends remember the first signs, phone calls that came too often, questions that cut too deep, sudden outbursts that left silence in their wake. What seemed like affection was laced with control. What looked like devotion was streaked with jealousy. Rihanna, shaped by a childhood where love and fear were twins, wanted to believe in forgiveness. She excused the anger, minimized the arguments, convinced herself that passion always carried fire, but slowly, she began to retreat, smiling less in rehearsals, avoiding questions from her team, keeping her pain hidden beneath couture gowns and chart-topping singles. Chris, equally young and unprepared for the weight of fame, carried his own shadows, the pressures of superstardom, his unresolved past, his volatility, all of it collided with Rihanna's hunger for stability. Their relationship became a storm in slow motion, calm one moment, lightning the next. The public saw only the highlights, the duets, the laughter, the glossy photos. They could not see the private fractures widening beneath. Rihanna, a woman adored by millions, was silently negotiating the cost of a love that thrilled and terrified her at once. Warnings existed, friends who whispered, tabloids that speculated, but in the blinding glow of their fame, those red flags were dismissed. They were too perfect, too young, too famous for the world to imagine anything else. Yet, inside the gilded cage of their romance, Rihanna was already paying the price. A piece of her freedom, a measure of her joy, the weight of her own silence. What began as a fairy tale duet was becoming something darker, a ballad that would crescendo not in harmony, but in devastation. It was supposed to be her night. February 2009, the eve of the Grammys, Rihanna was scheduled to perform in front of millions, the cameras ready to capture another coronation of the woman who had conquered the charts. But instead of spotlights, it was sirens. Instead of applause, it was whispers that grew into a roar. In the early hours, inside a quiet car on a Los Angeles street, everything collapsed. What began as an argument became an eruption. By the time silence returned, the image of Rihanna as untouchable was gone. The world awoke to headlines it could not comprehend. The brightest star of her generation had been hurt by the man she loved most. The shock was instantaneous. Photographs leaked, her face marked, her eyes heavy with something no song could disguise. Fans who had learned strength from her anthems now saw vulnerability laid bare. Questions multiplied like echoes. How could this happen? Why did no one see? How does love transform into something so destructive? For Rihanna, the days that followed were a blur of chaos. The Grammy performance was canceled. Her absence was louder than any song. Outside hospital walls and police stations, reporters camped like predators, waiting for every fragment of truth. Inside, she was just 20, frightened, reeling, carrying both the weight of her own pain and the crushing glare of a public hungry for answers. The music industry froze. Brands distanced themselves. Fans split into camps, and every detail of her private life was dissected by strangers. The couple who had once been celebrated as the future of R&B was now reduced to a cautionary tale, splashed across tabloids with merciless intensity. Rihanna, the girl who once sang of umbrellas and shelter, had been left exposed in a storm no one could shield her from. And perhaps the most haunting question lingered, one that echoed far beyond her own story. Why does the world wait until bruises are visible to believe that something was broken all along? The courtroom replaced the concert stage. Instead of music charts, It was legal documents that now carried their names. Chris Brown was charged with felony assault and threats, his mugshot printed alongside the same face that had once graced magazine covers as the future of pop. The case was swift, brutal in its clarity. He pled guilty, received 5 years of probation, community service, and mandatory counseling. To the law, it was a sentence. To the world, it was a spectacle. Commentators debated the fairness of the punishment. Some argued it was too lenient, others that his youth should excuse him. But beyond the verdict, one fact remained undeniable. Rihanna had become the most visible face of a violence millions endure in silence. Her fans rallied, but so did critics. Why had she stayed? Why had she returned even briefly to the man who had broken her? The questions were sharp, often cruel, overlooking the complexity of cycles that entrap so many. Rihanna was no longer seen only as an artist. She was judged as a symbol, a woman forced to carry the weight of a conversation the world had long avoided. Brands hesitated, headlines speculated, but her music remained. Yet every performance, every public appearance in those months was haunted by the echo of that night. At 21, Rihanna was forced to navigate not only trauma, but the relentless judgment of millions who claimed to know her better than she knew herself. The legal system had spoken, but the deeper sentence was invisible. The scars carried in memory, the public's endless gaze, the trust shattered in a woman who once believed love could be a refuge. For Rihanna, survival meant more than healing. It meant reclaiming her voice from a world that had reduced her to a victim. And so, while the law closed its file, Rihanna began writing her own case, not in courtrooms, but in music, in defiance, in a new image that refused to be defined by that single night. From the ashes of scandal, Rihanna rose not untouched, not unscarred, but transformed. She did not allow herself to be reduced to a victim or a headline. Instead, she turned the wound into a new kind of strength, rewriting the script that others had tried to impose on her. Her music carried the first signs of rebirth. Rated R was not an album of glittering pop, but a manifesto of pain, defiance, and survival. Songs bled with raw honesty, confronting the darkness head-on. Later, with Anti, she declared her independence not just from an industry that sought to control her, but from the narratives that once defined her. Beyond the stage, Rihanna rebuilt herself into more than an artist. She became a businesswoman, an innovator, a billionaire shaping fashion and beauty with the same daring spirit she once brought to music. But perhaps most powerfully, she became a symbol of resilience, of refusing silence, of showing millions of women that scars do not erase beauty, they deepen it. Her legacy is not only the anthems that filled clubs and charts, but the courage to stand in front of the world after the most humiliating exposure and say, I am still here. I am still me. Rihanna's story is a reminder that even at the peak of fame, love can wound, society can fail, and silence can be deadly. But it is also proof that healing is possible, that from pain can emerge power, from devastation, rebirth. The violet lights of Grammy stages, the flash of paparazzi, the endless scrutiny all remain. But what truly endures is the woman behind it all, resilient, defiant, unbroken. Rihanna did not just survive her storm, she became the storm.